Thank you for inviting me to speak at the 75th anniversary gathering of the Bund der Kunsthandwerker Baden-Württemberg. And thanks especially to you, Justus, for your very kind introduction. So, the bad news in such distinguished company is that I'm not going to talk about the craft this evening. On the other hand, every word I have to say tonight has direct bearing upon craft, on creative education, and in the expanded field of poiesis or making. As Justus was speaking, I was struck once again by the formative significance to my own development of a 10-year experience in the handmade glass crystal industry. 5 years as a furnace manager, a glass house manager, a production manager at Stuart Crystal, and latterly 5 years as head of product, process and brand design at Dartington Crystal. 1 minute I had been immersed in postgraduate study on metaphor as cognitive method in late Renaissance English and Italian poetry, since you ask, as a literary academic career that I abandoned without a safety net. I had to get a job, and before I knew it, I had resurfaced on the shop floor of a glass factory in Wordsley, in the area known as the Black Country, near Birmingham, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. A glass factory that could trace its origins on that site back to the 1760s, and whose métier, whose artisan culture and community had, by 1984, become a kind of endangered species. So, a curious, some may say perverse, academic trajectory, maybe. Was this your own kind of cultural revolution, my friend, the Chinese art historian Pan Yao Chang inquired of this episode in my working life, with a teasing smile broad enough to mask both his professional incomprehension and the seriousness of his question. The truth is that my re-entry into academic life was precisely the path of making, in the way of manufacturing, design, and product development. In glass factories, as organizations, and as artisan cultures, and as communities, through hands-on, reflective practice. In other words, through making at first and second hand, involving very little in the way of academic distance. This work involved, I would say, a sharp sense of exposure, something that I think everyone in the room this evening might recognize. As a form of embodied learning, making has this touch and hallmark, this immediacy of lived experience, because in art practice, as in art education, there is no subject for you to hide behind. Making, there's no subject for you as a maker to hide behind. By touch and through materials and processes, making comes before knowing. Making, or poiesis, has shaped and informed my approach to creative learning in general and to art, craft, and design education in particular, involving an understanding of art schools as, in themselves, human artifacts, as deliberate institutional constructs, And naturally, as one who seems to have spent most of their working life in workshops and studios, my formal interest in art schools goes far beyond the diverse artistic practices at work there. The studio is at the same time a physical and an imaginal space, facing both inwards and outwards, forever preoccupied with the oniric power, the dream, in other words, of work. Art schools are in themselves structural artifacts, made, remade, or unmade by successive generations of human purpose and political will, in wider national and global contexts, continually redetermined by use and occupancy and outward connectivity to an international network and community of practice. Art is not about life. Art is about living. And the purpose of learning in these terms is inseparable from that of living your life. Forgive me if I find it difficult in these terms and at this point to turn a blind eye to the image of an art school repurposed as a makeshift refuge for 400 people in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol, reduced to rubble and suffering by sustained, remorseless, unimaginable military aggression. But war is also a human artifact, styled by Sun Tzu as an art or skill. Its philosophical and technological dimensions bearing the hallmarks and seals of brutality and destruction as forms of malign human purpose. War is surely the darkest dimension of human artifice, the extreme form of unmaking, a negative poesis. Poesis, in this case, is the negative signature of our human species, the indelible mark we make upon the face of the earth in what increasingly we must think of as the late Anthropocene. I would like this evening to foreground the central significance of making, or poesis, not only as the conceptual dimension of craft, but far beyond the subject silo of the arts, of poesis as intrinsic to all human learning. Poesis as cognitive process and as thinking through materials. Making as thinking, thinking as a kind of making. Experiential learning as a learning that can only be fulfilled and completed through direct experience in specialized learning environments, in studios, workshops, laboratories, and performance spaces, inside and outside. All this, of course, amounts to unaffordable heresy in the minds of our education policymakers and their apparatus of justification, secure as this is within a prevailing target culture that is itself, of course, a fabrication, a deliberate human artifact. I've got nothing against cutting and sticking, a school inspector once said to me, around the same time that a very eminent professor of surgery in London was lamenting the increasing decline in haptic intelligence and fine motor skills in the hands of trainee surgeons. This is an issue that seems to concern me more and more the older I get. I speak from a UK perspective in the confidence, however, that this problem is not merely a consequence of Brexit mentality or of Brexit. Both harm and inequality accrue to learners, to curriculum and pedagogy, and to educational cultures as a whole, where making is marginalized and even erased and excluded from formal education in schools. And where creative learning environments, the art room, the kiln room, the dance studio, have been closed down. It's different here. 16-year-old first-year extended diploma students at Plymouth College of Art would tell me when I arrived there as principal in 2010. At school, they just teach you how to pass exams. Freed from confinement within a subject definition, and as no longer merely the technical exercise of a Wednesday afternoon, making or poesis resumes its contour as a distinctive mode of human intelligence. Making as thinking. Thinking as a kind of making. Making as poesis. Poetics as a term unlimited to the craft of literature, but by etymological derivation of our English word from the ancient Greek verb poiein, to make, as cognitive method. In this sense, the conceptual dimension of making resides not in theory but in poetics. And words and ideas are revealed as complex artifacts within the technology and fabric of language. My talk this evening is just such a text. Text, a word we derive from the classical Latin verb texere, which means not to write, but to weave. Text and textile coming from the same place in language. Making as poesis extends to materials, media, and modes of diverse kinds: physical matter, consciousness, environment, technology, technique, perception, language, concept, culture, identity, place. Each a formative dimension of learning and an essential framework in education. How are ideas made? How is language made? Or individual identity? Or community? Or history? And what kind of history? What do we make of ourselves? What do we make of our experience? And how does placemaking occur? And whose place is this anyway? Each of these questions provides a framing device for contemporary art, craft, and design practice as modes of inquiry, not unwoven from the fabric of people's lives, but in the warp and weft of purposeful living. The challenge to understanding in these terms is both perceptual and reflexive, and it's a question of poetics. How to see the idea in the artifact, and the artifact in the idea. There's nothing new in this idea. My awareness of my own historicity in these terms is such that reading Stephen Greenblatt's 1980 study, Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, discovers a useful paradigm or analogy for poesis in respect of making within contemporary pedagogy and in purposeful learning as inseparable from the business of living a life. Education as instrumental in what it is that we make of ourselves. As Greenblatt writes, as a term for the action or process of making, it is in the 16th century that the word fashion seems to come into wide currency as a way of designating the forming of a self. Perhaps the simplest observation we can make is that in the 16th century, there appears to be an increased self-consciousness about the fashioning of human identity as a manipulable, artful process. What we make of ourselves as cultural artifacts, either in formative behavioral terms or in constituting meaning in our lives, or indeed as creative practice, are questions that might properly locate poesis, making as learning, at the very heart of educational thinking. Poesis may indeed be central to social mobility, especially so at a time of profound technological change, social and cultural migration, and correspondingly insular reaction or retrenchment, terms that so conflict and define our present. And the role of poesis in social mobility would appear to be a neglected subject, offering useful avenues perhaps for further research. From an educational perspective, I am interested in the way that place and history, ideas and language matter, both as human artifacts and as significant points of reference connecting human agency in time. As Greenblatt says, there is in the early modern period a change in the intellectual, social, psychological, and aesthetic structures that govern the generation of identities. That change is difficult to characterize in our usual ways because it is not only complex, but resolutely dialectical. If we say that there is a new stress on the executive power of the will, we must say that there is the most sustained and relentless assault upon the will. If we say that there is a new social mobility, we must say that there is a new assertion of power of both family and state to determine all movement within the society. If we say that there is a heightened awareness of the existence of alternative modes of the social, theological, and psychological organization, we must say that there is a new dedication to the imposition of control upon those modes and ultimately to the destruction of alternatives. We are surely living through a period comparable in the scale of disruption in which if power is what separates people from what they can do, then poesis, as embodied experiential learning, that is, learning that completes itself in experience, can be the thing that connects people to what they can do. And maybe this can be the making of us, and the making of new alternatives within a conscious tradition. Asked what, if anything, he thought permanent in art, the British land artist Richard Long replied, "Maybe ideas, you know, the way they get handed down. Not simply ideas, in other words, or even ideas as artifacts, but crucially their transmission in ways embodied implicitly in the invocation of the hand, handed down, in a giver and a receiver, each a protagonist in the making and remaking of human purpose and culture. Words and ideas as artifacts preserve the indelible trace or signature of their making, an absence powerfully recalling an embodied human presence in terms of ethos, culture, and value, are continually made and unmade according to human purpose. We work, as Justus was saying, in just such a purposeful and living tradition, from John Ruskin and C.R. Ashby and William Morris to the Deutsche Werkbund, the Bauhaus, Loerland, to Black Mountain College, Dartington, perhaps to Plymouth College of Art. We make and remake those ideas handed down, the work of many hands, every day. In a conversation between the mother of a Year 1 pupil and the head teacher at Plymouth College of Arts, which was a mainstream 4 to 16 all through school established by Plymouth College of Art in the city's Stonehouse neighbourhood, one of the most disadvantaged areas in the country. By the way, she says, this is the mother. By the way, she says, the other week I picked my daughter up from school, and when we got home, asked her what she wanted for tea. Fish fingers, she said. So I went to the freezer, but no, not those, she said. I want real fish fingers. And then told me exactly what to do. So the next day I went out and bought fresh fish, and that night we made fish fingers together. It's not only in Stonehouse that something radical happens in the way of emancipation when a 6-year-old girl goes home from a culinary art lesson and proceeds to teach her mother how to cook fish fingers with raw ingredients from scratch. When the child leads the learning in the family, and mother and daughter in that moment cease being passive consumers of some processed and ready-made encounter, to become active makers of their own experience. Our problem, from the prevailing perspective of UK education policy, curriculum priorities, assessment criteria, and institutional control measures, is that none of this seems to count. The February 2012 free school application to the Department for Education to establish the Plymouth School of Creative Arts included a single paragraph prospectus or manifesto for culinary art as an exemplary feature of a curriculum designed to develop what Reinvesting in Arts Education, the 2011 report of the President's Committee of the Arts and Humanities, chaired by Michelle Obama, called 21st Century Skills. That is, I quote, habits of mind that include problem solving, critical and creative thinking, dealing with ambiguity and complexity, integration of multiple skill sets and the ability to perform cross-disciplinary work. This is the manifesto for culinary art in schools. Food is creativity and practical understanding. It is nutrition, health, and culinary art. It is craft and economics, design and entrepreneurship. Food is history and geography. It is culture and language in performance. Food culture is fundamental to human identities. Cuisine is teamwork and business and mathematics, applying laws of chemistry and biology and physics. Food culture is profoundly social and draws upon long centuries of diverse traditions. It is ethical and industrial, embodying enduring values of quality, service, hospitality, ecology, and aesthetics. Food is global knowledge, engendering essential skills for living. Cooking, or culinary art, or cuisine, because from year 7, the pupils at Plymouth School of Creative Arts learned culinary art in French. If they wanted to learn how to cook, they had to learn French. Culinary art was to be a central and significant feature of school life, an avenue for self-actualization and discovery, and a catalyst for creative confidence and self-esteem. In a small way, it aspired over the course of a generation perhaps to help improve community health in the Stonehouse neighbourhood, that the school's admissions policy was designed explicitly to serve a community in which adult and child obesity, alcohol and substance abuse, dietary and health issues remain endemic. It's in the top 1% nationally of the index of multiple deprivation in the UK, that neighbourhood. As learning experience, as poesis, this speaks with purposeful confidence and clear delight in self-discovery. In the words of a year 7 boy in The Red House, a 2017 film directed by Claire Hughes for the school's architects, Feld and Clegg Bradley Studios. So that film is available on the web, on the internet. And this is what he said. It taught me how to live and how to just be creative with whatever I make. And that can be with food, but that's also to do with anything else. I think that says it all. Thank you.